The morning sun cast long shadows across the training ground as Sergeant Sarah Mitchell adjusted her gear for what she expected to be another routine combat drill. At 26, she had already earned a reputation as one of the most skilled fighters in her unit, though her quiet demeanor often made others underestimate her abilities. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her uniform bore the insignia of someone who had worked hard to earn her place among the elite. Commander James Harrison stood at the center of the training area, his imposing figure commanding attention from every soldier present. At 42, he was a veteran of multiple deployments, his scarred hands and weathered face telling stories of battles fought in distant lands. His voice carried the authority of someone who had seen too much combat and had little patience for what he perceived as weakness. The other soldiers respected him, but many also feared his harsh methods and unpredictable temper. Sarah had been assigned to Harrison's unit 3 months earlier, transferring from a base where her skills had been recognized and appreciated. Here she found herself constantly having to prove her worth to a commander who seemed determined to find fault with everything she did. Despite her excellent performance records and commendations from previous assignments, Harrison treated her with barely concealed disdain, often singling her out for criticism during training exercises. The drill that morning was designed to test close-quarters combat skills, something Sarah excelled at despite her relatively small frame. She had spent years studying various martial arts disciplines, combining traditional techniques with modern military combat training. Her movements were precise and calculated, each strike delivered with purpose and control. Other soldiers in the unit had learned to respect her abilities, even if their commander refused to acknowledge them. As the exercise began, Sarah found herself paired with Corporal Davis, a larger soldier who outweighed her by nearly 50 pounds. The objective was simple: demonstrate proper hand-to-hand combat techniques while maintaining discipline and following established protocols. Sarah approached the exercise with her usual focus, executing each movement with textbook precision, while Davis did his best to keep up with her superior technique. Harrison watched from the sidelines, his expression growing darker as Sarah effortlessly countered every move Davis attempted. Her fluid movements and tactical superiority were evident to everyone present, but rather than acknowledging her skill, the commander seemed increasingly agitated. He barked orders and corrections that made little sense, clearly trying to disrupt her concentration and undermine her performance. Other soldiers began to take notice of the tension building between Sarah and their commander. Corporal Williams, who had served under Harrison for 2 years, had never seen the commander so openly hostile toward a single soldier. The atmosphere on the training ground became thick with unspoken tension, as everyone sensed that something significant was about to unfold. Sarah completed her demonstration flawlessly, helping Davis to his feet with the professionalism expected of a non-commissioned officer. She stood at attention, waiting for further instructions, but Harrison's face had turned red with what appeared to be rage rather than approval. The other soldiers exchanged glances, uncertain about what they were witnessing but sensing that their commander was about to cross a line. The training ground fell silent except for the sound of heavy breathing and equipment rustling in the morning breeze. Sarah maintained her composure despite the obvious hostility radiating from her superior officer. She had dealt with difficult commanders before, but something about Harrison's demeanor suggested this situation was different from typical military discipline issues. Harrison began circling Sarah like a predator stalking its prey, his voice rising as he listed supposed deficiencies in her performance that no one else could see. His criticism became increasingly personal and inappropriate, moving beyond legitimate military feedback into territory that made the other soldiers uncomfortable. Sarah remained at attention following proper protocol despite the verbal assault, but her jaw tightened slightly as the commander's words became more vicious. The other soldiers watched in growing discomfort as their commander's behavior became increasingly erratic and unprofessional. Several of them had served with Sarah long enough to know she was not only competent but exceptional at her job. Harrison's criticism seemed to stem from something other than legitimate concerns about her military performance, and the atmosphere continued to deteriorate as his voice grew louder and more aggressive. Private Johnson, the youngest member of the unit, looked confused and frightened by what he was witnessing. He had joined the military expecting discipline and structure, but this seemed different from anything he had been taught about proper military leadership. The tension was so thick it seemed like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to snap. Sarah's training kicked in as she maintained perfect military bearing despite the increasingly inappropriate treatment she was receiving. Years of service had taught her to remain professional even in difficult situations, but she could feel her muscles tensing as Harrison's verbal assault continued. Her hands remained at her sides, but those who knew her well could see the subtle signs that she was preparing for whatever might come next. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, but the warmth did nothing to ease the cold tension that had settled over the training area. Other units going about their morning routines began to notice the commotion, some slowing their activities to observe what was happening. Word began to spread quietly through the base that something unusual was occurring on the main training ground. Harrison's voice reached a crescendo as he stepped closer to Sarah, his face now inches from hers as he continued his tirade. The professional distance that should exist between a commander and subordinate had completely evaporated, replaced by something that felt more like a personal vendetta than military discipline. Sarah's breathing remained steady, but her eyes had taken on a focused intensity that suggested she was calculating her options. The critical moment approached as Harrison raised his hand, his face contorted with rage that seemed completely disproportionate to anything that had actually occurred during the training exercise. The other soldiers tensed, realizing they were about to witness something that would change everything for their unit. The morning that had started as routine training was about to become something none of them would ever forget. In that instant before contact, time seemed to slow down as everyone present realized they were witnessing a complete breakdown of military discipline and professional conduct. Sarah's reputation for remaining calm under pressure was about to be tested in ways she had never experienced, while Harrison's career was about to take a turn that would have consequences far beyond this single moment. The stage was set for a confrontation that would demonstrate the difference between true strength and the abuse of authority, between someone who had earned respect through competence and someone who demanded it through intimidation. What happened next would become a story told throughout the military community for years to come, serving as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration depending on one's perspective. The training ground held its collective breath as the situation reached its breaking point, with Sarah standing firm in the face of what was clearly inappropriate behavior from a superior officer, while Harrison seemed completely oblivious to how far he had strayed from acceptable military leadership standards. The next few moments would define both of their futures, and serve as a lesson about the true meaning of strength, discipline, and professional conduct in military service. The strike came without warning, a sharp slap across Sarah's face that echoed across the training ground like a gunshot. The sound seemed to hang in the air as everyone present processed what had just happened. Commander Harrison had crossed a line that no military officer should ever cross, striking a subordinate during what was supposed to be a professional training exercise. The red mark on Sarah's cheek stood out starkly against her pale skin, but her expression remained remarkably controlled, despite the shock and humiliation of the assault. For a moment that felt like an eternity. Complete silence dominated the training area. The other soldiers stood frozen, uncertain how to process what they had witnessed. This wasn't military discipline or tough training. This was assault, pure and simple. Corporal Williams felt his stomach drop as he realized the gravity of what had just occurred. He had seen harsh commanders before, but never one who had completely abandoned professional standards in such a dramatic fashion. Sarah's eyes blazed with controlled fury, but she maintained her position at attention even as her cheek throbbed from the impact. Years of military training had ingrained in her the importance of following proper channels and maintaining discipline even in the most challenging situations. However, something deeper than military protocol was stirring within her, a fundamental sense of self-respect that refused to accept such treatment from anyone, regardless of their rank or position. Harrison seemed to realize immediately that he had made a catastrophic mistake, but his pride and anger prevented him from acknowledging it. Instead, he doubled down on his aggressive behavior, pointing his finger inches from Sarah's face while continuing his verbal assault. His words became increasingly incoherent as he struggled to justify what everyone present knew was completely unjustifiable behavior from a military officer. The other soldiers began to shift uncomfortably, their respect for military hierarchy warring with their basic human decency and their growing respect for Sarah's professionalism under impossible circumstances. Private Johnson looked like he might be sick, while Corporal Davis, who had just been sparring with Sarah moments earlier, took an unconscious step forward as if to intervene before catching himself and remembering the complex dynamics of military rank and protocol. Sarah's mind worked quickly as she processed her options. She could file a formal complaint through proper military channels, but that process could take months and might result in her being transferred or facing retaliation from Harrison's allies within the command structure. She could simply endure the abuse and hope it didn't escalate further. But something inside her rebelled against the idea of accepting such treatment. Her father had been a career military officer who had taught her that true strength sometimes required standing up to bullies, even when those bullies wore higher rank insignia. The training ground had become the focus of attention from other units as word of the confrontation spread quickly through the base. Soldiers from nearby exercises had begun to gather at a respectful distance, their presence adding additional pressure to an already volatile situation. Among them was Master Sergeant Rodriguez, a highly respected senior non-commissioned officer who had been observing the situation with growing alarm. Harrison noticed the growing audience and seemed to realize that his actions were being witnessed by far more people than just his immediate unit. Rather than backing down or attempting to defuse the situation professionally, he appeared to become even more aggressive, as if the presence of witnesses had triggered something primal in his need to maintain dominance and authority through intimidation rather than respect. Sarah could feel the weight of all those eyes upon her, but more importantly, she could sense the support and sympathy from her fellow soldiers. They might not be able to intervene directly due to military hierarchy, but their presence served as both witnesses to Harrison's inappropriate behavior and silent supporters of her right to be treated with basic human dignity and respect. The physical pain from the slap was nothing compared to the deeper injury to her professional pride and personal integrity. Sarah had devoted her career to serving her country with honor and distinction, earning her rank through competence and dedication rather than intimidation or political maneuvering. To be struck by a superior officer during a routine training exercise felt like a betrayal of everything the military was supposed to represent. As Harrison continued his verbal tirade, seemingly oblivious to how completely he had destroyed his own credibility and authority, Sarah made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. The military had taught her about appropriate responses to various threats, including how to defend herself when faced with physical aggression. What Harrison had done wasn't just inappropriate. It was assault, and she had every right to defend herself according to both military regulations and basic human rights. The moment of decision arrived when Harrison, emboldened by what he mistakenly interpreted as submission from Sarah's continued silence, raised his hand for a second strike. This time, however, Sarah was ready for him. Years of combat training, martial arts practice, and physical conditioning had prepared her for exactly this type of situation, even though she had never imagined she would need to use those skills against a fellow American officer. Time seemed to slow down as Harrison's hand moved through the air toward Sarah's face for the second time. The other soldiers watched in fascination and horror, realizing they were about to witness something unprecedented in their military experience. The morning sun cast sharp shadows across the training ground, creating a dramatic backdrop for what was about to become a defining moment in all of their careers. Sarah's response was swift, precise, and devastating. As Harrison's hand approached her face, she moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent countless hours perfecting her combat techniques. Her left hand shot up to intercept his wrist, stopping his strike with surprising force, while her right hand positioned itself strategically at her side. The expression on her face shifted from controlled endurance to focused determination as she prepared to defend herself properly. The other soldiers gasped audibly as they realized Sarah was not going to simply accept another assault from their commander. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been approaching the situation cautiously, stopped in his tracks as he recognized the combat stance Sarah had assumed. As a veteran of multiple deployments, he knew exactly what was about to happen and found himself both horrified by Harrison's behavior and impressed by Sarah's tactical positioning. Harrison's eyes widened with surprise and rage as he realized his second strike had been blocked. The shock of meeting effective resistance seemed to trigger an even more violent response from him as he attempted to use his superior size and strength to overpower Sarah's defense. What he failed to realize was that size and strength meant little when facing someone with superior technique, training, and the moral authority that comes from being clearly in the right. The confrontation reached its climactic moment as Harrison tried to force his way through Sarah's defense, his face contorted with rage and embarrassment at being thwarted by someone he considered inferior. Sarah's training kicked in completely as she shifted from defense to offense, her movements becoming fluid and purposeful as she prepared to end the confrontation decisively and professionally. The training ground fell completely silent except for the sound of the two combatants breathing heavily as they faced off against each other. Everyone present knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come, a moment that would define both participants and serve as a lesson about the difference between true leadership and the abuse of authority. What happened next would demonstrate that real strength comes not from rank or position, but from skill, training, and the moral courage to stand up for what is right, even when facing seemingly impossible odds. Sarah's response would be swift, decisive, and completely justified, under both military regulations and basic human rights, serving as a reminder that even in hierarchical organizations, there are limits to what authority figures can do to those under their command. The stage was set for a conclusion that would satisfy both military justice and poetic justice, as years of professional training were about to meet the consequences of unprofessional behavior in a confrontation that neither participant would ever forget. Sarah's counterattack was a masterpiece of controlled violence and technical precision. As Harrison struggled against her defensive grip on his wrist, she pivoted smoothly on her left foot, while her right hand drove upward in a perfectly executed uppercut that caught the commander squarely under his chin. The impact lifted Harrison's feet completely off the ground for a brief moment before he crashed backward onto the training ground, with a thunderous impact that seemed to shake the earth itself. The assembled soldiers watched in stunned silence as their commander lay motionless on the ground, his eyes rolled back and his body completely limp. Sarah stood over him, her stance still perfectly balanced and ready for continued action if necessary. But it was clear that the confrontation was over. Harrison had been knocked unconscious by a single, expertly delivered blow from someone half his size, demonstrating the difference between raw aggression and skilled technique. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to break from the collective shock, rushing forward to check on Harrison's condition, while simultaneously calling for medical assistance. His experienced eye immediately assessed that while the commander was unconscious, he appeared to be breathing normally and showed no signs of serious injury beyond his damaged pride and the inevitable headache he would wake up with. As Rodriguez knelt beside the fallen officer, he looked up at Sarah with an expression that mixed professional concern with barely concealed admiration. In his 23 years of military service, he had never seen such a perfect demonstration of justified self-defense, executed with such precision and restraint. Sarah had used exactly the amount of force necessary to end the threat without causing permanent damage, showing both her superior training and her fundamental respect for human life, even when dealing with someone who had forfeited his right to respectful treatment. The other soldiers gradually emerged from their shocked silence, their conversations a mixture of amazement, concern, and barely suppressed excitement at witnessing something they would tell their grandchildren about. Corporal Williams found his voice first, asking Sarah if she was injured and expressing his support for her actions. His words seemed to break the spell that had held everyone frozen, and soon the entire unit was clustering around Sarah to offer their encouragement and support. Private Johnson, who had looked terrified during the confrontation, now approached Sarah with something approaching hero worship in his eyes. The young soldier had been struggling with his own confidence since joining the unit, intimidated by Harrison's harsh methods, and wondering if he had made a mistake by joining the military. Seeing Sarah stand up to the commander's abuse, while maintaining perfect military bearing and technique, had given him a new understanding of what real strength and professionalism looked like. Sarah herself remained remarkably composed despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. She helped Rodriguez position Harrison in the recovery position while they waited for medical personnel to arrive, demonstrating the same professionalism and concern for others that had characterized her entire military career. Her cheek still bore the red mark from Harrison's slap, but her demeanor showed no signs of the anger or satisfaction one might expect from someone who had just delivered such decisive justice. The medical team arrived within minutes, led by Captain Martinez, the base's senior medical officer. As they began their assessment of Harrison's condition, Martinez quietly asked Sarah about her own status and whether she needed any medical attention for the assault she had suffered. His professional manner made it clear that he understood exactly what had transpired and that his sympathies lay entirely with the victim rather than the aggressor. While the medical team worked on Harrison, Rodriguez took charge of the situation with the calm authority that had made him respected throughout the base. He began taking statements from witnesses, making it clear that this would be investigated thoroughly and properly according to military regulations. His questions were professional and thorough, but it was obvious to everyone present that he believed Sarah's actions had been completely justified and appropriate under the circumstances. Word of the incident spread through the base with remarkable speed, as military communities always do when something significant occurs. Within an hour, soldiers from other units were finding excuses to walk past the training ground, hoping to catch a glimpse of Sarah or hear more details about what had happened. The story grew slightly with each telling, but the core facts remained unchanged. A respected non-commissioned officer had been assaulted by her commander and had responded with perfectly justified and executed self-defense. Colonel Peterson, the base commander, arrived on scene personally to assess the situation and ensure that proper procedures were being followed. His conversation with Sarah was brief but supportive, making it clear that she had acted appropriately and that Harrison's behavior was completely unacceptable for any military officer. The colonel's presence also served notice to everyone that this incident would be handled at the highest levels and with complete transparency. As Harrison gradually regained consciousness, his first words were threats and demands for Sarah to be court-martialed for striking a superior officer. His continued aggressive behavior, even after being knocked unconscious, served only to reinforce everyone's opinion that his actions had been completely unjustified and that Sarah's response had been the minimum necessary to protect herself from further assault. Rodriguez calmly informed Harrison that he was being relieved of command pending a full investigation into his assault of a subordinate during training exercises. The witnesses to the incident, including several senior non-commissioned officers and a master sergeant, had provided consistent statements that completely supported Sarah's version of events and contradicted Harrison's attempts to justify his behavior. The investigation that followed was thorough but swift. As the facts were clear and the witnesses were numerous and credible, Harrison faced charges of assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, and abuse of authority, while Sarah was commended for her restraint and professionalism in a difficult situation. The military justice system, often criticized for protecting senior officers, worked exactly as designed when faced with such clear-cut misconduct. Harrison's military career effectively ended that morning on the training ground, though the formal processes would take several months to complete. His assault on Sarah and his subsequent attempts to justify his behavior had destroyed any credibility he might have retained, and his superiors made it clear that there was no place in the modern military for officers who abused their authority in such a flagrant manner. Sarah's reputation, already strong before the incident, was enhanced further by her handling of an impossible situation with grace, skill, and appropriate restraint. Her response became a case study in military training programs, demonstrating both proper self-defense techniques and the importance of maintaining professional standards even when facing provocation. The unit itself underwent significant positive changes in the aftermath of the incident. With Harrison removed from command, a new commanding officer was assigned, who recognized and appreciated the skills and professionalism that Sarah and her fellow soldiers brought to their duties. The toxic atmosphere that had characterized the unit under Harrison's leadership was replaced by one of mutual respect and genuine military discipline. Years later, Sarah would reflect on that morning as a turning point in her understanding of leadership and professional responsibility. She had learned that true strength sometimes requires standing up to authority figures who abuse their power, and that the military systems of justice and accountability, while imperfect, generally work when faced with clear cases of misconduct. The story of what happened that morning on the training ground became legendary within military circles, serving as both inspiration and warning depending on one's perspective. For junior soldiers facing inappropriate treatment from superiors, it demonstrated that the system would protect those who defended themselves appropriately. For officers and senior non-commissioned officers, it served as a reminder that authority must be exercised with wisdom and restraint. Sarah continued her military career with distinction, eventually rising to senior leadership positions where she became known for her fair treatment of subordinates and her unwavering commitment to professional standards. The lessons learned that morning, about courage, restraint, and the proper use of authority, informed every decision she made as a leader, and helped her create the kind of positive command climate that brings out the best in military personnel. The training ground where the incident occurred was eventually renamed in honor of Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had handled the aftermath with such professionalism and wisdom. But those who were present that morning would always remember it as the place where a young sergeant demonstrated that true strength comes not from rank or position, but from skill, courage, and an unwavering commitment to doing what is right, even when facing seemingly impossible odds.